The Twin Towers had 47 core columns welded together that were continuous down to the bedrock and up to the top. There were 240 perimeter box columns built in segments, then lifted and bolted together. Floor assemblies made with trusses and a metal decking that held lightweight concrete were placed between the core and perimeter columns. At the top was a hat truss that tied the core columns together, designed to support an antenna on Tower 1. Some of that steel was covered with asbestos that was expensive to remove. Almost everyone understands how the towers went up, but even today hardly anyone really understands how those towers came down. In most large failures, the basic cause is pretty well understood the day it happens, even before any official investigation. For example, everyone knew the basic cause that made the Tacoma Narrows Bridge fall was the wind. And everyone knew the cause for this building collapse was because of an earthquake. And everyone can see that the reason why the Key Bridge fell was because a container ship hit the main support. On the day the towers fell, the reason was obvious to many. Everyone was talking about explosions, including those inside who got out.
Of the explosion, just explosion.
It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Lots of firefighters heard explosions.
We was in an explosion. We was in the lobby, and the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
We watched the first explosion.
We could hear explosions.
You want to call your mother or something?
The media, who were reporting live and unscripted, knew.
Actually, devices that were planted in the building. There was another explosion that took...
Huge explosion that we all heard. An explosion.
And another explosion.
Explosion, a lot of explosions.
And we could see explosions.
Oh, it just blew up. Did you see that blow out? Mm-hmm.
And even those who watched from a distance knew that explosives were used.
How did it happen? Did it go down or what happened? Did it explode?
It exploded from the middle.
From the middle? From where the crash was?
I guess so, but I don't think it's from the fire.
They said building blew up.
Oddly, the following day there was no mention of all those explosions. But there was also no agreement as to how they fell either, and the reasons given were very confusing. For example, the day after the event, we were told by the experts that the steel melted. In just under an hour, a raging fire from burning aviation gasoline softened or perhaps even melted the steel.
As the steel began to soften and melt, the interior core columns began to give.
Within 3 days, a paper by university professors was submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers as a rapid communication, which explained a brand new collapse phenomenon called the crush-down, crush-up theory. This theory explains how the lighter block of floors fell down on a larger, stronger block of floors, crushing those lower floors all the way down to the ground while remaining intact, and then, once the lower structure was demolished, the smaller upper block finally crushed itself back up. Although this phenomenon has never been seen or can be replicated by experiment, this pile driver theory persists today as one way to explain how the towers fell. Rather than that crush-down, crush-up pile driver theory, we were also told it was a floor-by-floor pancake collapse.
Once the trusses fail, the floors they were holding cascade down with a force too great to be withstood. The result is what's called a progressive collapse, as each floor pancakes down onto the one below.
Of course, there are pancake collapses, but mostly with concrete buildings resulting in stacks of floors. The problem was, with 110 floors in the towers, there weren't any floors at ground zero. So within 1 week, we had 3 different collapse theories from the experts. The melted steel theory, the crush-down, crush-up pile driver theory, and the progressive pancake collapse theory. But no mention of all those explosions that everyone was talking about the day it happened. Mainstream experts cloud the issue using confusing formulas, stick figures, or simplistic animations trying to explain their theories, rather than showing the actual collapse. In most cases, their graphics or simulations neglect key structural components. For example, this graphic doesn't look at all like what we just saw the day before. This animation didn't show those 240 perimeter columns, but does show the core standing. This one doesn't show the core standing. And this one forgot all perimeter and core columns, making the towers look almost invisible. Well, what about the official government investigations? The aim of the bipartisan 9/11 Commission report was to provide the fullest possible account of the events surrounding 9/11. Their fullest possible account to explain the collapse of WTC-2 took just 2 sentences, and their fullest possible account to describe the collapse of WTC-1 took only 1 sentence. There was no mention of the collapse of WTC-7. Later, we were told that collapse, which looked exactly like a controlled demolition causing absolute free fall, was because of random office fires. The first real engineering investigation into the collapse of those 3 buildings was the Building Performance Report by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and the American Society of Civil Engineers, or ASCE. The ASCE basically wrote the book for structural design. So if anyone could solve how those buildings fell, it's the American Society of Civil Engineers. The final report determined there were truss failures, causing a floor-by-floor pancake collapse. This was different than the crush-down, crush-up pile driver style of collapse described in the ASCE rapid communication. Okay, they now said it's a pancake and not a pile driver collapse. Still, there was that nagging lack of evidence of all those pancake floors. But then they said, with the information and time available, the sequence of events leading to the collapse of each tower could not be definitively determined. It turned out, when all was said and done, FEMA and the American Society of Civil Engineers couldn't even figure out the sequence of events that led to the collapse, let alone the actual collapse process itself. Out of all those engineering experts, none of them could determine how the towers collapsed. So the collapse of those twin towers remained a mystery. There were so many lingering questions that finally, about a year after 9/11, Congress tasked the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, to determine why and how WTC-1 and WTC-2 collapsed following the initial impacts of the aircraft. NIST is one of the top scientific agencies in the country, if not the world, with hundreds of experts in various fields of science. This was, by far, the most comprehensive study to date by some 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts and 125 leading experts from the private sector and academia. If anyone could figure out how those towers collapsed, it would be all those experts on the NIST team. The final report, which contained over 10,000 pages, was issued in October of 2005. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. This sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it includes little analysis of the structural behavior of the tower after the condition for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. In other words, the most comprehensive tower report ever by perhaps the top experts in the world ended before the collapse even began. Their sequence of events leading up to the beginning of the collapse abruptly ended before the actual collapse by simply stating, "Global collapse then ensued." Later, when asked why NIST didn't analyze the collapse process itself, NIST responded that the computer models were not able to converge on a solution. NIST also said, "As we mentioned previously, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse." So in summary, after millions of dollars and years of study, 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Of all those 200 experts, none focused on the actual collapse, none took professional responsibility as nobody signed and sealed the report, and all were exempt from liability. No part of any report resulting from a NIST investigation into a structural failure or from an investigation under the National Construction Safety Team Act may be used in any suit or action for damages arising out of any matter mentioned in such report. So why is the collapse of these buildings that murdered so many so baffling to the experts, and why so many different explanations? The authorities will tell you that you're too stupid to understand how a building falls down because it's too complex and you should rely on the experts. They will also tell you to ignore anything on the internet unless it's from the government study or corporate media. And whatever you do, don't think for yourself or dare question. But you're not stupid at all, and you'll get it once you see the evidence. You don't need to be an engineer or architect or scientific expert to understand how a building falls down. Just like most people don't need to be a meteorologist to tell when it's raining. So let's take a closer look at this using the actual collapse and not some computer simulation to see if we can figure out what all those experts could not. The total time for the tower's fall, that is, from when the first motion is detected to when the last part of the tower hits the ground, is reported in many documents, such as that bipartisan commission report. At 9:58:59, the South Tower collapsed in 10 seconds. That crush down, crush up analysis by university professors who show the motion histories for the entire collapse duration at about 11 seconds for the South Tower and 13 seconds for the North. Mainstream media.
After burning for 53 minutes, the South Tower collapsed in 11 seconds.
The North Tower falls in 13 seconds. But with a greater number of floors above the impact site of the South Tower, it takes only 11 seconds.
Even the official NIST frequently asked questions asked about the times for collapse. How could the WTC towers collapse in only 11 seconds for WTC-1 and 9 seconds for WTC-2, speeds that approximate that of a ball dropped from a similar height in a vacuum with no air resistance? All the experts seem to be in agreement that the total collapse time is less than about 13 seconds. But is it? The time to fall seems rather basic, so how about if we watch the collapse of the North Tower and measure the total collapse time ourselves? "13 seconds, but it ain't over." I get right around 30 seconds, but it's not 11 or 13 seconds like they told us. It's over twice that. So why do they keep saying the shorter time frame for the total collapse? Surely the official NIST study realized something as basic as a total collapse time. Well, although NIST is implying that the collapse time was 9 or 11 seconds in that question, their response acknowledges the total time by stating, "From video evidence, significant portions of the cores of both buildings, roughly 60 stories of WTC-1 and 40 stories of WTC-2, are known to have stood 15 to 25 seconds after collapse initiation before they too begin to collapse." NIST also provided timelines of key events starting from the plane's impact to the beginning of collapse at 10:28:20. It lists the beginning of the final fall of the inner core columns 28 seconds later at 10:28:48. Those last two entries in their timeline last for another 28 seconds. Adding the time for the core to finally fall gets us to about our 30 seconds. So there it is. The entire time for the North Tower to collapse is about 30 seconds. How did the 200 technical experts, including about 85 NIST experts, explain this total time of 30 seconds? Well, they didn't, because it was after collapse initiation. But they did say, as we mentioned previously, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Yet even today, years after the event, physics YouTube videos attempting to explain the collapse still say,
The North Tower came down in 13 seconds, and the South Tower took just 11 seconds. Later, when the collapse of the tower initiated, it went down in just a few seconds.
Or they said the total time cannot be measured.
The reality is that nobody knows how much time the building took to collapse.
But we just measured it, and so did NIST. Let's take a closer look to see if we can figure out what the experts couldn't after years of study. The destruction of WTC-1 can be divided into 4 primary stages. The visible roof stage is the time where we can still see evidence of the roof. It lasts for about 3 seconds before the roof is completely gone. This is the only time that an accurate rate of downward acceleration can be measured, and the downward acceleration is about 2/3 the rate of freefall. The crush-down, crush-up piledriver theory relies on the upper floors to remain intact as a single block in order to crush the undamaged floors below. However, if you observe the actual event, the upper volume of floors did not remain as a block. To the contrary, it was the very first thing to be destroyed. If the first volume destroyed was the upper block, then that upper block of floors could not have crushed the lower, stronger structure below. What did the 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, have to say about the upper block being destroyed first? As we mentioned previously, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Another thing noticed in this first phase are parts of the perimeter walls, especially where the planes hit, were observed to initially bow inward. This inward bowing only happens once and not continuously during the collapse process. If it was a pile driver action, wouldn't you expect at least some additional inward buckling of the lower walls during the process, like when a can is crushed? The NIST model explained this inward bowing by assuming that the floor trusses sagged from the heat, and that sag pulled the outside columns in. This theory is the exact opposite of the FEMA ASCE report, where they said the trusses broke and the perimeter columns bowed out. The problem with their saggy truss theory was that the models and tests didn't produce enough force, so by trial and error, they added an artificial force of up to 5,000 pounds, or 5 kips, from some unknown source until the model matched the observed bowing. One possible source of that additional force could be from the falling core columns. What if explosives were placed on the core columns during one of the largest elevator upgrades by one of the smallest elevator companies, causing them to fall first? That falling core would naturally pull on the outside columns. It would also explain why the antenna was observed to drop a fraction of a second before the perimeter. That pull, combined with the weight above, bowed those outside columns in, and then the bolted wall segments broke, snapping the lower columns back out. But can outward explosions really cause inward bowing? To test this falling core theory, I built this mechanism. Obviously, it's not intended to be any type of scale model of the towers. Rather, the intent is to demonstrate the sequence and direction of motions caused by an explosive force. Using firecrackers, blowing out the support allowed the core column to drop, which in turn pulled on a link connected to the outside column. That link pulled the outside column end inward, demonstrating the theory. Regardless if the perimeter columns bent in or out, let's assume that all columns in the impact zone buckled simultaneously due to the office fires, and let's assume the upper section remained as a unified block like they want us to believe. Whether the weight of the upper stories are measured in tons or titanics, the undamaged supporting columns could hold at least 3 times that weight on 9/11. This means that any downward acceleration of the upper floors must experience a dramatic impact when it hit the lower structure. The crush-down, crush-up addendum paper describes how the top block of floors would have created one powerful jolt on impact. So do physics videos.
The sudden impact force of this huge weight over the floor right below it trashed the lower floors.
This jolt, or negative acceleration such as this one, can be measured. And this one can be seen. There is always a jolt on impact. There has to be if it fell by gravity alone. But we have a serious problem, and that is there was no jolt. The upper floors smoothly accelerated down with no measurable impacts whatsoever. None of the floor-by-floor pancake or crush-down, crush-up pile driver theory works in practice. Every single experiment with an upper section falling onto a structure that could once support it, regardless of material, shows the same thing. It has an impact, deceleration, or a jolt. The only possible way you can get a smooth downward acceleration with no impacts or jolts is with explosives. They destroy the understructure, allowing the upper section to smoothly accelerate down. That's because any self-supporting structure capable of carrying 3 times its weight will always experience a jolt if falling by gravity alone. What did the 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, say about the problem of the missing jolt? As we mentioned previously, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. The second stage is mostly one of lateral or horizontal destruction of the floors, roof, and perimeter walls that lasted for about 10 seconds. Notice all the material is being blown outward away from the lower floors. Parts of the towers were blown horizontally up to 600 feet away at speeds over 75 miles per hour. Since the material was blown outside and away from the footprint, that weight could not have hit the undamaged structure below. The weight on the underlying structure is actually getting less and less, and not more and more, as the pancake theorists want you to believe. Also notice how the waves of destruction are not parallel. Half the floors are racing ahead of the rest. That can't be a floor-by-floor or pile driver collapse driven by gravity alone like they showed us. Notice the high-velocity, rapidly timed sequence of explosions. What you are watching are controlled demolition charges coming from inside the towers, blowing the floors and walls outward, and not some external directed energy weapons that some still believe. Notice how the corners lag behind the destruction of the floors. This is also noticeable on the destruction of Tower 2, where the corners stand for a bit longer than the perimeter walls that are being blown out. One explanation is that the tower's corners were not in a direct path of the explosives placed on the back of the core columns that held the floor trusses. Separate charges that were slightly delayed were necessary to take down the corners. The blowing of all that material out and away from the footprint is why we don't see a big stack of 110 floors at ground zero. Instead, we see lots of steel all cut up into segments. Gravity and office fire cannot cut steel like that. Let's compare what the experts showed us to what really happened. The real destruction is shown on the left, and the animations the media showed you is on the right. Do any of those cartoons look like the actual destruction of the towers? Of course not. The corporate media's misinformation and the government's disinformation are gaslighting the entire population. So why do they keep using animations rather than videos of the actual destruction? Because they don't want you to see the obvious explosions blowing out the floors and walls and having you figure out that a gravity collapse makes no sense at all. So what did the 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, say about the lateral destruction, blowing all the material outward and away from the lower structure? As we mentioned previously, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. The third stage is the standing core phase. These inner core columns, sometimes called the spire, stood for about 14 seconds after the roof and floors were on the ground. These core columns were mentioned but never explained by NIST. This is a massive independent structure that stood over 600 feet tall, taller than the Washington Monument. Notice that all the columns are cleanly cut near the 60th floor, way below where the plane hit. Look at those columns on the left as they are being cut into sections, trailing white smoke as they tip over and fall. It's not jet fuel, office fires, gravity, Osama bin Laden, or some other nonsense they said cutting those columns. It's explosive cutter charges taking them down. Are those white bands some of those explosives? Maybe, maybe not. Notice how these long, tall, standing columns are not bent. With its bracing now stripped, the capacity of these long columns is much less than its design capacity when braced at each floor. This means that any downward force applied during the collapse process had to be less than their design capacity, or they would have buckled. Just like a plate cannot fall through a toothpick, the upper floors in the roof must have been destroyed, as they could not have passed down through those spire columns without causing them to bend. The very existence of these standing core columns means that all gravity collapse theories are impossible. The 9/11 Commission report, the FEMA ASCE report, the NIST report, and all pancake and pile driver theories that rely on gravity alone cannot fall through those columns. All gravity theories get impaled by the spire. So why do they keep saying the total collapse time is 13 seconds? Because it's these 14 seconds in the third phase of collapse that they are trying to hide from the public, because this spire alone makes everything they told us impossible. The pile driver and pancake theorists want you to believe that the sequence of force was down first and then out. If that was true, then there would be impacts and you would see the jolt on the top floors. They also want you to believe that the horizontal motion was just some sort of springing action caused by the falling floors. If that was true, you would also see jolts. If it was down first and then out, those long skinny columns of that spire would have buckled if anything significant fell on them during the first two stages of collapse. Nature says that those down and out theories are wrong, and nature can't be fooled. Instead, the sequence of force had to have been out first and then down. Explosives destroyed the underlying supports, allowing the building to smoothly fall. Out and down. Out and down. Out and down. And out and down. Only this out and down sequence of force explains why we don't see any jolts, why those perimeter walls were launched so far away from the lower structure, why there aren't any pancake floors at ground zero, and why that spire stood with no buckling. The upper floors and walls were blown out and away, never impacting those slender columns. So what did the 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, say about the standing core columns that stood for so long after the upper floors were already down? As we mentioned previously, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. The fourth and final stage was the fall of those core columns, which lasted for about another 3 seconds. After standing strong for over 10 seconds, they too fell almost straight down in what should have been their path of most resistance. At the beginning, notice how it drifts sideways before the final fall. Let's listen to how controlled demolitions are rigged.
The job of the shape charge is to cut steel H-beams.
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which through a series of beams cut at the same angle will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
Could this walking be what's happening to those core columns? That spire didn't turn to dust, and it didn't fall into a 600-foot deep hole at ground zero. Those core columns were cut, allowing it to fall down through the smoke. We can see those cut segments at ground zero. Regardless, what did the 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, say about the inner core columns that fell almost straight down? As we mentioned previously, we are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. The experts want you to believe that there were only two phases of destruction, the crush down and the crush up phase, shown in their ASCE papers. They also want you to believe that the towers fell in less than 13 seconds. But we just watched 4 phases of destruction that took 30 seconds, so any graphic to be accurate should have looked something like this. Why did the professors who came up with that impossible crush down, crush up theory show a two-phase collapse that doesn't match reality? And why didn't the 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, understand the four phases of destruction? Because it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And of course, because those towers were intentionally brought down with explosives. Evidence of explosives were found on the steel and in the dust. Red-gray chips of nanothermite, a high-tech explosive, as well as iron-rich microspheres were found. Those microspheres are a known residue of a thermite reaction. That also indicates extremely high temperatures that cannot be from office or jet fuel fires. What did the 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts, say when asked if the steel was tested for explosives or thermite residue? They blew it off, saying, NIST did not test for the residue of these compounds in the steel. Congress gave NIST an impossible task to determine why and how WTC-1 and WTC-2 collapsed following initial impacts of the aircraft. How do you fill that task without stating the obvious, that the twin towers and everyone inside were intentionally blown up? When it's obvious that the goals cannot be reached, don't adjust the goals, adjust the action steps. The goal, of course, is to fool you. So first, delay as long as possible. It is not necessary to bury the truth. It is sufficient merely to delay it until nobody cares. Second, rephrase the question, then answer that rephrased question in detail. Don't answer why and how the towers collapsed. Answer why and how the collapse initiated. Develop a massive report that takes years of study. Waste time modeling minutia that doesn't matter and ignore what does matter, then conclude before the real event begins. Third, use omission lies. A lie by omission is a type of deception that occurs when someone intentionally leaves out important information to create a misconception, mislead, or skew the truth. The NIST concluding statements, while technically true for the towers and other controlled demolitions, are not true for a gravity collapse. The reason why those statements are true was intentionally omitted. Adding the phrase, because explosives blew out the supports, clarifies those statements and makes perfect sense. Global collapse then ensued, because explosives blew out the supports. Collapse became inevitable because explosives blew out the supports. Neither tower could have arrested the progression of collapse once collapse initiated because explosives blew out the supports. The floors below the level of collapse initiation were unable to resist the suddenly applied gravitational load from the upper floors of the buildings because explosives blew out the supports. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance to the falling building mass at and above the impact zone because explosives blew out the supports. Once people began to see the fraud, 9/11 accelerated the destruction of trust in the corporate media, American institutions, the political parties, and government agencies. Obviously, they've been lying to you about 9/11. They have to, because it's serious. Those who thought it up, set it up, blew it up, and are covering it up have managed to mock or block all those who question the event. They passed the Patriot Act that took your freedoms while they made billions, adding trillions to our debt with their wars. If you're an American, you will pay for those wars plus interest as the debt piles up and the value of your fiat dollar goes down. Meanwhile, they use those 9/11 laws to blacklist and monitor millions of Americans who trusted their government and fought in or paid for their wars. For those who fooled us into accepting those laws and supporting endless wars, 9/11 truly was a mission accomplished. But you don't need a 3-year investigation to understand that the wind brought down this bridge, a ship brought down that bridge, an earthquake brought down this building, and explosives brought down those twin towers. Once the evidence is seen, a child can see right through their official 9/11 story. Because the fact that those towers were intentionally blown up is as plain as a nose on your face. And the nose on those attempting to defend the official narrative is getting longer every day. Because the 9/11 Commission report that gave the fullest possible account could not explain the last 30 seconds. The Federal Emergency Management Agency could not explain the last 30 seconds. The American Society of Civil Engineers can't explain the last 30 seconds. The 200 technical experts, including about 85 career NIST experts and 125 leading experts from the private sector and academia, can't explain the last 30 seconds. No professor, no engineer, no architect, no expert, no university, no government agencies have ever explained those last 30 seconds. And no experiment has ever been done that can mimic the motions seen in those last 30 seconds by fire and gravity alone, because nature can't be fooled. Nobody can explain the one event that murdered the most on 9/11. Those towers were intentionally demolished by explosives that even the media could see before the cover-up began.
It happened the same way. The explosion started high in the building and worked its way down. There you see the building imploding. Do you see what's happening? I think we're safe. Here I think I'm on safe ground, Bill. I don't think this was clearly the way the structure is collapsing. This was the result of something that was planned. It's not accidental that the first tower just happened to collapse and then the second tower just happened to collapse in exactly the same way. How they accomplished this, we don't know. But clearly this is what they wanted to accomplish.
So if you like fairness and the few freedoms that you still have that our founding fathers fought so hard for, perhaps you should wake up and help spread the truth before truth becomes treason and free speech is deemed hate speech and outlawed. The reason why every expert ignores those last 30 seconds is because all gravity collapse theories are impossible. Those twin towers were brought down intentionally with explosives. But if you or someone you know still believes that official story, can you explain the last 30 seconds?